We've all seen footage claiming monsters are real, and some of it looks surprisingly authentic. But science sets an extraordinarily high bar. Until a claim can be repeatedly tested, verified by independent experts, and backed by physical proof analyzed in a lab, it remains a myth, not a scientific reality. But what if some of these creatures aren't as impossible as they sound? Because when you look at what evolution has already created, things get very strange. Giants. For thousands of years, humans have told stories about giants. Enormous people, taller than everyone around them, strong enough to become legends. And eventually, those stories created something even more interesting. Claims of physical evidence. Giant bones. Giant skulls. Entire skeletons supposedly discovered buried beneath the ground. But here's where we have to be careful. Some of the most famous giant discoveries turned out to be hoaxes. The Cardiff giant, for example, was presented in 1869 as the petrified body of a 10-foot-tall man. People paid to see it. Newspapers covered it. People argued about whether it was proof of ancient giants. It was fake. The statue had been deliberately buried as a hoax. So if the famous giant skeletons aren't reliable, does that mean giants were completely impossible? Not exactly, because we know something much stranger is real. Humans can become extraordinarily tall. Robert Wadlow reached 8 feet 11.1 inches, 2.72 meters. His height was measured under medical supervision. So an enormous human wasn't physically impossible. It actually happened. But there's a huge difference between one exceptionally tall human and an ancient population of giant humans. Bigfoot. Imagine walking through an ancient Asian forest and seeing something standing above you. Not a human, not a bear, an enormous ape. That sounds like mythology, except the ape actually existed. Its name was Gigantopithecus blacki. It was the largest known primate, and fossils show that it lived in what is now southern China for roughly 2 million years before disappearing during the late Middle Pleistocene. But here's the fascinating part. We don't have a complete skeleton. Much of what we know about Gigantopithecus comes from teeth and jaw material. So we're reconstructing an enormous extinct ape from fragments. And that leaves a giant gap between what we know and what we don't. Could an ape lineage related to something like this have survived somewhere isolated? There's no evidence that it did. No confirmed body, no verified DNA, no scientifically authenticated Bigfoot. So Bigfoot isn't established as a real animal. But the idea isn't interesting because someone filmed a blurry shape in the forest. It's interesting because Earth has already produced an enormous ape. And that means the basic idea of a giant forest-dwelling ape isn't something nature never tried. It already did. And now we're going to take the thought experiment one step further. Because what if the animal didn't come from an ape? What if it came from a wolf? Werewolves. Humans came from a lineage of primates. So here's the question. What if evolution did something similar to wolves? Not a human turning into a wolf. A completely different evolutionary path. Start with an ordinary wolf. Now imagine a population becomes isolated for an enormous amount of time. Its environment changes, its food changes, its competitors change, and natural selection begins favoring different traits. Maybe greater intelligence becomes valuable. Maybe manipulating objects becomes useful. Maybe seeing over tall vegetation becomes an advantage. Maybe walking upright occasionally becomes more efficient. Generation after generation, small changes accumulate. The legs become different. The spine changes. The forelimbs become more useful. The brain becomes larger. Communication becomes more sophisticated. And eventually, you could imagine something that still carries obvious wolf ancestry, but moves through its environment in a completely different way. Not a werewolf from a horror movie. Something more disturbing, but moves through its environment in a completely different way. A new species that evolved from a wolf lineage and became intelligent enough to resemble us. Would evolution actually take that exact path? And if that's strange, wait until we get to the creature that doesn't just hunt animals. It hunts with something almost impossible to survive on. Vampires. A creature that comes out at night, avoids bright sunlight, has unusually sharp teeth, and survives by feeding on blood. A vampire sounds completely impossible, but blood feeding itself? Nature already does it. Some animals have evolved to make blood their food source. So let's run another evolutionary experiment. Imagine an isolated human population facing an extreme environment where normal food becomes increasingly difficult to obtain. Over many generations, suppose blood becomes an increasingly important part of the diet. This is where our scenario becomes speculative. There's no evidence that an Ice Age human population evolved into vampires. And while prehistoric humans sometimes practiced cannibalism, that doesn't mean humans evolved toward vampirism. We're imagining what could happen if evolution pushed a lineage in that direction. The first problem would be nutrition. Blood isn't a perfect food. It's extremely rich in some nutrients and poor in others. So a hypothetical blood-feeding human would need major physiological adaptations. Its digestive system would have to process large amounts of blood. Its kidneys would have to handle the resulting chemical load. And its mouth would need a way to efficiently obtain blood. That brings us to the teeth. Forget giant movie fangs. A more realistic evolutionary starting point would be stronger, elongated canine teeth capable of puncturing skin. Over enormous amounts of time, natural selection could favor increasingly specialized feeding structures. And then comes the sunlight. Not because drinking blood magically makes someone allergic to the sun, but because our hypothetical population could become increasingly nocturnal. If most activity happens at night, traits that improve nighttime vision and reduce dependence on bright daylight could become advantageous. Eventually, you could imagine a human-descended creature that is pale, nocturnal, highly adapted to blood feeding, and equipped with specialized teeth. Not immortal, not supernatural, not transforming into a bat, just a radically different evolutionary branch of humanity. And that brings us to the strangest monster of all. Because this time, we aren't asking what would happen if humans became more like another land animal. We're asking what would happen if humans left the land entirely. Mermaids. For most of human history, we've lived on land. We walk, we breathe air, we use our hands. Our bodies are built around a terrestrial lifestyle. So imagine something completely different. A human population becomes increasingly dependent on the ocean, generation after generation, thousands of generations, then millions. And evolution starts responding. Here's the important part. We already know evolution can do this. Whales are mammals. Their distant ancestors lived on land. Over tens of millions of years, their descendants gradually adapted to life in the water. Their skeletons preserve that transition from terrestrial mammals to fully aquatic animals. So evolution has already performed the basic experiment. Land mammal, ocean specialist. But what if the starting animal was human? The changes would be enormous. Swimming would become more important than walking. The body could become more streamlined. Insulation would become critical. Breathing would become one of the biggest limitations. The eyes would face a completely different optical environment. The hands and arms would have to balance manipulation against efficient swimming. And the biggest question of all, what happens to the legs? Would they remain? Become more efficient for swimming? Fuse? Or eventually be replaced by an entirely different propulsion system? We don't know, because humans never took this evolutionary path. But the transformation itself isn't outside the history of life. Land animals have returned to the water before. Whales did it, and they became some of the most extraordinary animals on Earth. A mermaid isn't scientifically plausible because folklore says one exists. It's interesting because evolution has already demonstrated that mammals can return to the ocean. The difference is that nobody has demonstrated it happening to humans. So, what did we actually discover? Giants? We have real examples of extraordinarily tall humans, but no verified evidence of an ancient race of enormous humans. Bigfoot? We have evidence that enormous apes really existed, but no confirmed evidence that one survived into the present. Werewolves? A wolf lineage becoming something radically different is an evolutionary thought experiment, but there's no evidence that such a creature exists. Vampires? Blood feeding is real in nature, but a blood-dependent human species has never been discovered. Mermaids? Mammals really did evolve from land into the ocean, but there is no evidence that humans ever followed that path, and that's where this whole question gets interesting, because possible isn't the same as real. Evolution can do things that sound impossible, but science doesn't decide something is real because it sounds plausible. It needs evidence, something independent researchers can examine. And if someone claims they've discovered a monster, the question isn't, does the footage look convincing? The question is, where's the evidence? Because until the evidence survives testing, the monster is still a story. And maybe that's the most fascinating part. Because somewhere out there, evolution has already created creatures that would have sounded like monsters to us. We just know they're real because we found the evidence. So if a real monster ever does appear, we won't need a legend to tell us. We'll need a laboratory. So which of these 5 surprised you the most? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to see what science says about the strangest things humans could actually become, subscribe.